In the desert near Thebes, statues lay smashed in pits. A queen had worn the beard of a king. Later, someone tried to make sure no one remembered her face. And yet the stone survived just enough to ask one dangerous question. How does a ruler powerful enough to command Egypt almost vanish from history? Because Hatshepsut did not just break a rule, she stepped into the one role the ancient world guarded most fiercely and made it look natural. That was her genius. And in the end, it was also the weakness of everything she built. Long before her memory was attacked with chisels, she had already done something even harder than winning a throne. She had convinced an empire that a woman could stand at the center of divine kingship, not as a queen behind the curtain, but as pharaoh. Not consort, not regent, not caretaker. King. That was never going to be a simple change of title. In ancient Egypt, kingship was more than politics. It was ritual, image, cosmic order, the idea that the world itself stayed balanced because the right person stood between gods and men. Hatshepsut understood that better than almost anyone. She was the daughter of Thutmose I, born inside a royal world where bloodline mattered, ceremony mattered, and legitimacy mattered most of all. She later married her half-brother Thutmose II, as royal custom demanded. From that marriage came a daughter, Neferir, but no son. And in dynasties like this, the missing son was never just a family problem, it was a political opening. When Thutmose II died, the throne passed to his young son, Thutmose III, born to another wife. The boy was still a child, so Hatshepsut stepped forward as regent. At first, nothing about that seemed revolutionary. A powerful royal woman protecting a young king was familiar enough. Egypt had seen strong women before. But regency is a dangerous position. The closer you stand to the throne, the more people begin asking whether you are simply guarding it or quietly becoming it. For a few years, Hatshepsut ruled in the expected way. Then, somewhere in that slow transfer of authority, the line moved. By around the 7th regnal year of the young Thutmose III, Hatshepsut was crowned king herself. Not queen acting like a king, not queen ruling through a child. King. It is one of the boldest political transformations in ancient history. And what makes it even more extraordinary is that she did not seize power in a single chaotic coup, at least not in the dramatic way movies would want. She moved through ritual, titles, imagery, and elite support. That mattered because raw force can take a palace. It cannot easily take an idea as old as kingship itself. Hatshepsut seems to have known that if she wanted to rule, she had to do more than sit on the throne. She had to make her rule feel inevitable. So she did what great rulers always do. She built a story. In inscriptions and reliefs, she tied herself to divine favor. At Deir el-Bahari, her temple would later present her birth as something touched by Amen himself, a cosmic answer to a political problem. That was not vanity in the shallow sense. That was legitimacy, carved into stone. She also gathered loyal officials around her, men who controlled the machinery of state. Among the most important was Sananmut, the royal official tied to major building works and the education of Neferuri. Power in ancient courts rarely survives on blood alone. It survives because the right people decide survival is in their interest. And under Hatshepsut, enough of them did. Even her public image changed with calculated care. At first, artists experimented. She could appear with a female body and royal regalia. But over time, her formal portraits increasingly showed her in the ideal language of kingship, the kilt, the headdress, the ceremonial beard, the body of a male ruler. Modern eyes sometimes see that as disguise. Ancient Egyptian political art worked differently. These images were not meant to be private confessions. They were statements of what the ruler was supposed to be. Hatshepsut was not pretending to be a man in the ordinary sense. She was presenting herself in the accepted visual grammar of kingship, because if Egypt expected a king to look a certain way, then the safest move was to look exactly like that. That decision tells you everything about her intelligence. She did not try to overthrow the system from the outside. She stepped inside it so completely that the system had to bend around her. And for a while, it worked brilliantly. Her reign was not remembered as an age of endless conquests. It was remembered as a period of prosperity, building, artistic energy, and controlled strength. There may have been a campaign in Nubia early on. But Hatshepsut's rule is far more closely associated with trade, wealth, and monumental construction than with battlefield glory. That choice mattered too. A new ruler, especially an unusual one, does not always survive by being louder than everyone else. Sometimes survival comes from proving the state is richer, calmer, and more stable under your hand than under anyone else's sword. Hatshepsut's Egypt looked like success. And success is persuasive. Nowhere was that more visible than at Karnak and Deir el-Bahari. At Karnak, she added important works including obelisks and sacred structures tied to Amun. These were not decorative side projects. They were declarations that the gods still favored the throne and the throne still favored the gods. Then there was her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, her greatest architectural statement. Set against the cliffs on the west bank near Thebes, it rose in terraces and colonnades with a kind of calm confidence that still feels modern. It was designed to overwhelm without shouting. The temple echoed an older monument associated with Mentuhotep II, but on a much grander scale. That was no accident. Hatshepsut was linking herself to earlier greatness while also outdoing it. The result was more than a tomb complex. It was political theater in stone. Every ramp, terrace, and relief told Egypt that her rule was not a temporary arrangement. It belonged to the deep order of the kingdom. And then came the voyage that helped define her reign. The expedition to Punt. Even now, Punt carries a mist of mystery around it, a trading land beyond the Red Sea, remembered through reliefs and cargo lists more than neat modern borders. What matters is what the expedition meant. It meant Egypt reaching outward not simply to conquer but to acquire wonder. The scenes carved at her temple celebrate exotic goods, fragrant woods, ivory, precious materials, incense, animal skins, and even living myrrh trees brought back to Egypt. Think about that image for a second. Not just sacks of wealth, trees. Living proof that her reign could import prosperity itself and plant it in sacred ground. That is a ruler thinking in symbols as much as economics. The Punt reliefs do exactly what good propaganda is supposed to do. They turn policy into spectacle. They tell the viewer that under Hatshepsut, the world did not merely submit to Egypt. It came willingly, carrying gifts. And if you were an elite watching this unfold, what did you see? You saw temples rising, trade flourishing, sacred order affirmed, and a ruler who, whatever old customs said, was clearly making the machine work. That kind of reign is very hard to argue with. Which may be why later efforts to erase her had to be so deliberate. You do not chisel out a failure. You chisel out a success that became politically inconvenient. At the height of her power, Hatshepsut had solved the central problem of her life. She had made the extraordinary appear legitimate. That is rarer than military genius. Anyone can terrify a court for a season. Very few can persuade an entire civilization to treat innovation as continuity. And yet there was a danger hidden inside that brilliance. Her rule depended heavily on image, ritual framing, and careful control of the story. It was stable, yes. But it was also vulnerable in a very specific way. If your power is built into monuments, titles, sacred imagery, and official memory, then an enemy does not always need to defeat your armies. He only needs to attack the memory. That is what makes Hatshepsut so fascinating. Her greatest battlefield may not have been against foreign powers at all. It may have been against forgetting. Before we go further, I want to hear your take. Was Hatshepsut the more impressive ruler for building prosperity and legitimacy without relying on constant conquest, or does military greatness still outweigh that in ancient history? Drop your answer in the comments and tell me whether you think ruling through stability is harder than ruling through fear. Because while Hatshepsut was building one of Egypt's most dazzling royal images, time was still moving. Thutmose III was not going to remain a child forever. That reality hung over everything. He and Hatshepsut were co-rulers on paper, but she was the dominant king for much of her reign. That arrangement could function while her authority held and while the political world around them accepted the balance. But dynastic politics are rarely kind to unusual solutions. The very thing that made Hatshepsut exceptional also made her difficult to fit neatly into a succession story. And succession stories matter more than truth. They matter because kings do not just inherit land. They inherit a narrative. Who came before? Who had the right? Who interrupted what? By the end of Hatshepsut's reign, Thutmose III was taking a more prominent role in state affairs. That suggests transition, not immediate catastrophe. There is no clear evidence of some dramatic palace showdown, no confirmed final confrontation where one walked into the throne room and the other fell. Reality is often quieter than legend. Hatshepsut likely died after roughly 2 decades as pharaoh. And at first glance, that should have been the end of an extraordinary reign and the beginning of a respectful dynastic handoff. But history did not let her go so easily. Years later, efforts were made to remove traces of her kingship. Her statues were torn down. Her monuments were defaced. Her name was removed from official king lists. For generations, this looked like the obvious story. The wrong stepson finally got revenge. The old stereotype wrote itself: humiliated boy king, wicked stepmother, delayed vengeance. It is dramatic. It is clean. And it may be too simple. More recent interpretation has complicated that picture. Some scholars now argue that at least part of the destruction of her statues fits a broader Egyptian practice of deactivation, breaking royal images at weak points to neutralize their power. That does not mean Hatshepsut was treated kindly. It means the motives may have been more political, ritual, and pragmatic than purely personal rage. And in a strange way, that makes the story even colder. Hatred is emotional. It burns hot. Systematic erasure is administrative. It is patient, selective, and terrifyingly calm. If Thutmose III and later interests wanted the royal line remembered in a smoother sequence, Hatshepsut was a problem. Not because she had ruled badly. Because she had ruled too well while not fitting the pattern. A dynastic narrative is like a temple wall. The figures must stand in the right order. And Hatshepsut stood where later power preferred empty space. So, the stoneworkers went to work. Images damaged, names removed, statues buried and shattered. Not audible sense, wild frenzy, but with enough purpose to reshape memory. That matters, because erasure is not the same as simple destruction. Destruction is anger at what exists. Erasure is an attempt to control what future generations are allowed to know. In other words, Hatshepsut was attacked twice. First by the political limits of her own world. Then by the historical limits others tried to place around her after death. And this is where her fatal flaw comes into view. It was not recklessness, not cruelty, not some melodramatic descent into madness. It was her faith that legitimacy, once successfully staged, could protect itself. She mastered the symbols of kingship so completely that she may have believed the performance had become permanent reality. But in royal politics, permanence is often the grandest illusion of all. A monument can make a ruler look eternal. It cannot stop a later ruler from rewriting the captions. That is the tragedy. Hatshepsut proved she could occupy the role. What she could not fully control was how later power would explain that occupation. And perhaps no one could have. Because if a dynasty decides that your memory disrupts its preferred story, then your greatest buildings can become targets instead of shields. Your statues become evidence to be neutralized. Your brilliance becomes the reason you must be edited out. Still, even the erasure was incomplete. That failure is one of the most poetic parts of her story. The people trying to remove Hatshepsut could damage images, bury fragments, and alter lists. They could not unmake the scale of what she had built. Deir el-Bahari remained. Karnak remained. Broken statues remained, even in pieces. And the pieces were enough. Centuries passed. Her name faded into obscurity. Then, after hieroglyphs were deciphered in the modern era, scholars began reading the walls again. A strange contradiction emerged. Female names, male kingly images. At first, even that caused confusion. But slowly, the lost ruler came back into focus. Not as a rumor, not as legend, as evidence. Stone by stone, inscription by inscription, Hatshepsut returned. That is why her story feels almost supernatural without needing any myth at all. A woman claims the highest office in one of the ancient world's most tradition-bound civilizations. She rules successfully. She builds magnificently. She is pushed out of the official story. And then the monuments she used to secure legitimacy become the very things that rescue her from oblivion. That is not just irony. That is one of history's great reversals, and it changes how we should see her. Hatshepsut is sometimes introduced simply as a female pharaoh, as if gender alone is the whole miracle. But the real achievement goes deeper. Many people break barriers for a moment. Far fewer govern well after breaking them. Hatshepsut did both. She did not merely occupy space made by someone else. She reshaped royal power in a way that forced Egypt to accommodate her, at least for a generation. Her reign also reminds us that the ancient world was not static. Even in a civilization built on order and precedent, politics could bend when intelligence, symbolism, and circumstance aligned. That does not make Egypt progressive in the modern sense. It makes Hatshepsut formidable in the ancient one. She understood institutions so well that she could bend them without pretending they did not exist. That is why she still feels modern. Not because she was ahead of her time in the cliché sense, because she recognized that power is often less about breaking the stage than mastering every cue on it. And then there is the darker lesson. Even massive success does not guarantee fair memory. The people who come after you often decide what your greatness is allowed to look like. Sometimes they celebrate it. Sometimes they trim it down. Sometimes they try to bury it in sand and broken stone. Which is exactly why Hatshepsut still matters. Her story is not only about a woman who ruled Egypt. It is about how power justifies itself, how memory is edited, and how hard it is to erase someone who truly changed the shape of a civilization. So when you look at those statues now, damaged and silent, they do not really feel defeated. They feel interrupted. Because the erasure failed. Her name came back. Her temple still rises from the cliffs. Her reign is still studied, argued over, admired, and reassembled from fragments by people who refuse to let the official version have the last word. And maybe that is the most fitting ending she could have. Not untouched glory. Recovered glory. The kind that has to fight its way back into human memory. If you enjoyed this story, hit like, so more people find the channel. And if you want more rulers, conquerors, and power struggles told like this, subscribe and stay with us. I also want your answer below. Which leader should we cover next? Another Egyptian giant like Thutmose III or Ramses II, or someone from a completely different empire? Because the next story might be about a conqueror who won almost everything and still could not hold on to peace. And once you hear how that empire was built, Hatshepsut's version of power starts to look even more extraordinary. So stay close. The next ruler is already waiting in the shadows.